Hey everyone, this is the SIG-Auth meeting for December 6th, 2023. This will be the last meeting for the year. We have a pretty full agenda because we haven't met in a while, so things have been kind of piling up. Let's get started. Greg, were you able to fix your mic? This video is not on, so now I'm like wondering if Greg's. You want to come back to Greg? Maybe go to Tahir for pod identity certificates.
All right. Yeah, so this is, I don't know if we can have a little discussion right now, but this is mostly like, hey, go take a look at this proposed KEP. It's basically, this is kind of like the next step in the sort of arc of work that started with cluster trust bundles. So those let you distribute trust anchors, so like root certificates, into pods. And this is the other half. This lets you put client certificates or server certificates into pods with a kubelet volume that sort of automatically handles rotating the certificates as needed. It's all spec'd out to be reusable by third parties. So like if you have a service mesh, it could easily adopt this. But the only use case sort of actually put into the KEP would be giving the ability to issue a client certificate that Kube API server understands, and using that instead of a token to authenticate to Kube API server.
So as part of, I haven't read the KEP, but it is using the CSR API, right? The existing CSR API.
Yes.
As the mechanism. Okay.
It's a kubelet. It's a new kubelet projected volume that when you put it into your pod, you can say what signer you want the certificate to be addressed to, and what key type you want. And then kubelet will generate a key, send a certificate signing request to the designated signer with a specially formatted CSR inside it. And then the signer implementation, signer and approver can decide, hey, I want to issue that, or I don't want to issue that, issue the certificate, and then kubelet puts the issued certificate into the pod volume. And then it repeats that for rotations before the certificate expires. Let's see what
in this model, can I, as a pod author, use an HSM?
No, I've left TPM back keys out of it for now, because I wasn't quite sure. I think first we would need to figure out how to surface TPMs into pods in sort of like a standardized way. But nothing about it precludes it. Like in the future, we could add a separate volume type that is the same, except that kubelet holds the key in a TPM. The problem is, how does kubelet let the pod like open a TLS connection using that key that kubelet has created in TPM? I think there's a lot of complexity.
I mean, the flow I was thinking about more was that can the pod just provide you with its public key, and we skip the whole CSR bit where we have to sign the CSR? I don't actually know what threat model that whole like signature actually validates.
I am of the opinion that that would be okay. There are people who feel rather strongly that you need to have a proof of possession. So like you need to demonstrate that you can sign some arbitrary data with the private key. I've read the RFCs that they refer to, and it's kind of like, well, this is kind of a good idea, but I don't see how it's.
Yeah, I just don't know like what the attack is like you could get a certificate that is for someone else's private key, but you don't have the private key. So what would you do with it? Like you can already get their certificate if you're having a connection with them, right? By just like virtue of. regular connection. So I just don't know what it protects.
I definitely think that's something we should investigate in the future. However, like I want to get, I agree. The ideal case would be that the key is stored in TPM, but it felt like too much to bite off for this.
The other thing I wanted to ask was, you mentioned the API server client certificate. So how does that work? And I'm like looking at you, Micah, in environments like EKS where that just don't work. Like you can't get a cert like that because they don't let you get a cert like that. And it's not part of conformance explicitly because we don't make you do that on your environment.
How do you feel about implementing revocation?
I mean, I'm going to ask for revocation. So at some in various aspects. So yes, but
like I can definitely see this being useful. Not that the API, I would necessarily let my API server use it, but like if I wanted a spiffy cert or I don't know, something. I guess that's the other question is like, I haven't read the cap. I'll give it a read, but like, how flexible is the CSR and the identity that gets set and all that?
So the CSR here is actually not flexible at all. Kubelet always issues a fixed format CSR. The implication is that and it's like totally custom. So not spiffy, not anything. We define a new X509 extension that is no. Sorry.
no, this is totally normal. I love this. This is like regular life for me.
Yeah, we define a new X509 extension that is like a pod identity, and it just has fields for like namespace, name, blah blah blah. Then the API server does the node restriction, but if it sees a CSR that is using that extension, it won't let you do it unless you're kubelet and you are, actually running that workload. And then the signer can look at that identity in the CSR, and they could, if they wanted to, issue a certificate that has that same structure, or more likely they will ignore the structure and just use the identity and issue whatever cert they feel that identity should have.
On that point, you said it's like a custom X509 extension specific to Cube. At that point, why would we not simply just embed things directly into CSR as first class fields? If we're doing custom anyway?
Mostly for the proof of possession, and also because my experience on cluster trust bundles has thoroughly disabused me of the notion that editing existing is like it's very hard.
I mean, but like adding extra metadata into the CSR isn't necessarily different than adding new fields to the CSR v1 API, right? Like we're still changing the meaning of a field and expecting it to like behave correctly. I guess you could say because the CSR is parsed as PEM and we're within the realm of PEM, it was maybe like old servers aren't going to screw up anything. Like, is it going to be a critical extension? Like, is it going to be like, if you don't understand it, you're supposed to fail?
I think that kind of so for the CSR, for the issuance half of the flow, I think it doesn't make a difference whether it's critical or not, right? It's the only thing in the cert. If you don't understand it, like you got to be specifically set up to understand these certs. For the issuance side, I think most people are not going to be, or most signers would not be issuing certificates that contain this extension, except for the Cube API server client issuer. And in that case,
so you're saying
critical.
there would be a brand new way of issuing certs that is specific to this flow that behave in the same way that client certs do, but they have this extension, maybe?
Yes.
Okay.
And the reason for that is, we could also include the CN blah, blah, blah in there, but this also is like, has the same bindings as a token. So the certificate is explicitly bound to a pod.
Oh, I see. Now I understand. Okay, yeah, that wasn't clear to me that when you were saying that it was going to use the API server signer, that it was. Okay, so it's like the same type of client, but now it has like the bound properties that we have for tokens, but for the client server.
Yeah.
Okay. So, hey, Micah, that is technically revocation of a variation. It's not time-based revocation or explicit revocation, but you can delete the pod. But I think we would want to make that extension critical then, so that way you, if you tried to present it to an actor that didn't understand it, that they would just fail at X509 validation.
Sure, yeah. I think that is up to the signer, right? It's the signer and issuer who choose whether or not the extension is marked critical. For the Cube API server pod client case, we could set it as critical.
I guess it's just to get back at the motivation. Is it we don't like service accounts because they're bearer tokens and they can be logged and replayed and all this stuff? Is that the main goal here?
Well, the other goal is to provide an extension mechanism for other outer tree signers to be able to basically provision credentials that, like, you can't do that for tokens because the credential is the token, so you can't have that like split sort of hierarchy. Whereas, like, if I want to have like a custom signer that lets pods have identities for my service mesh or something, I should be able to do that. And the nice thing about this is I don't need a sidecar or anything. Right? I just need to run a controller. It doesn't even need to be on the cluster. It just needs API access, and it just needs to be able to watch for CSRs and approvals and such.
Yeah, I would say personally, my motivation is like 50-50. 50%, this would be a big security improvement for the ecosystem as a whole, to be able to securely get these certs without, if you're careful with this machinery, you can end up with a way to get a cert into a pod without relying on a bearer token at any step of the process. And 50% is then taking that security improvement and applying it to in-cluster pods communicating with API server.
And I guess who's responsible for refresh? Kubelet?
Kubelet, yeah.
Well, the app has to reload the file also, but yes.
Correct, yeah.
Okay. Jordan, do you have any thoughts? We're like awfully quiet.
I don't.
It's okay.
Sorry. Anytime we're talking about revocation, I'm skeptical that it'll actually work.
I think in this case, so we cannot make revocation work for the whole third-party use case, but for the first-party client cert case, we can make it work because Cube API server is the one doing the decision. So you present this cert, and if your pod is not still running, then you're revoked.
Yeah, so that's similar to the jobs we issue. So the jobs have a timestamp on them. Cube API server might disallow earlier than that if the pod's gone, the node's gone or something. So.
Yeah, on that like refresh expiration point, like are we going to have like minimum, maximum that we support, recommend, enforce? Like if I have a signer that only signs 7-day certs, is that okay?
There is a CSR duration field on CSR, but it's optional because it's added later. But we could be more strict with it in some way now. For these types of like newer certs, we could be more strict with them. It's a brand new.
Yeah, I'm thinking too of like minimums with like with the rotation, like if the whatever your rotation period is, maybe you rotate every day, even if you have a 7-day cert, hypothetically, so that you have a longer static stability. I don't know, but it's an area that probably needs to be covered in the KEP.
So rotation is covered, but I've expected to be not very flexible right now. I said Kubelet always requests a certificate of 24 hours lifetime, but the signer is free to ignore it and issue whatever they want, except that Kubelet will refuse to use a certificate if it has less than 10 minutes of lifetime.
Okay.
And then Kubelet always tries to start refreshing the certificate at the lesser of 50% of the lifetime or 1 day.
With some jitter.
Definitely jitter everywhere.
Yeah, so that sounds roughly like what we do for bound service account tokens, right?
And this would block pod creation too, right? So if you had like a really high pod creation rate,
Yeah.
I was all using this. Yeah. You have to wait on your signer to sign every.
Right. Yeah, so it does have to be highly available and very fast because it is in the critical path of pod creation. I mean, the same is true for bound service account tokens, but today that's just a file on disk against the API server. So that one is fast as long as the API server is up. Right. Yeah, so I still need to read the KEP, and I plan to do that. I don't know if so I'm only here next week, and then I'm gone for the holidays. So, what are we planning for this? And what release are we in? 130.
My hope is, so I've got a draft implementation ready. My hope is to keep that in sync with the KEP as I take feedback on the KEP, and then my stretch goal is get the KEP and the alpha implementation into 130.
Right, so nominally, like maybe early January, we should plan for an API review on this, or that seem good?
Yeah.
All right, so that means I have to look at this before that, so that way I can be of a functional, useful API review. Okay.
Just treat it like a Christmas story for your kids.
Oh, dude. But you know,
But
like I leave,
and all through the house.
yeah, I leave the Kubernetes books mixed in with my kids' books, and every so often my kids will like take it to their grandparents and be like, read this book to me. And then they're just like losing their mind trying to read the book. They're like, what is a pod? What is Kubernetes? What is a replica set? I was like, you guys don't know how to read the story. Okay, back to all right. Anything else on this topic? Otherwise, we can go back up to Greg. Hopefully, Greg's audio is awesome now. Okay, cool. Greg.
Yeah, we'll see. Do I sound more normal now?
Yeah.
Much better. Yeah.
Okay. I just went and killed a bunch of Chrome tabs. So I talked to a few people at KubeCon. I talked to Micah and I talked to Jordan separately about this. But so we did this talk at KubeCon about binding system anonymous to cluster admin, and you can go watch the talk if you like. But I think everyone's probably familiar with this problem that people are going out there and doing things they shouldn't with system anonymous. And I had some people come up to me after the talk and be like, "Oh my God, how does that happen?" And I'm like, "You can just like Google advice for this and you will find bad advice on the internet that's like someone's got an authorization problem and they're like, oh hey, just bind cluster admin to system anonymous and all your problems go away." So like people are out there, yeah, like I mean it works, like your problems do go away, you get different problems, but so like people are out there doing that, unfortunately. So like we on GK we just blocked this in our built-in admission, like this specific case, like cluster admin to system anonymous. But it did prompt, I think, like a like preparing for this talk, and we were like, well, we should probably have like another discussion about system anonymous. I think we've had a few over the years. And talking to Jordan, and then the other thing we did also too was like we went through and looked at all of the usage we could find, because we went through and notified people, and so in the process of that, we looked at sort of like what was being bound and how these mistakes were being made. And these were the ones we found. We found some use cases for health checks. KubeADM Bootstrap, I think, uses it. Rancher uses it for like a pre-authentication thing. There's a ton of PSP bindings, but we probably don't really care about those anymore because
to anonymous, really? I don't even understand that. Like
what, PSP or which one?
PSP.
Yeah. So what people are doing with PSP is they're binding restricted to anonymous. So I think like the thinking is
that doesn't even work because the pod is always authenticated, so like it's never anonymous. Like What does that even mean?
Yeah, if I was looking at those bindings, I was like, I think what people are trying to do is just make sure everyone's got PSP restricted unless I've like given them something else, and they were just like, let's bind it to that, and maybe that'll do something. But anyway, like it doesn't really matter because like PSP is deprecated on all the supported versions anyway. So I think like those bindings might exist, but maybe they never did anything. But now they definitely don't matter. And then the other one was like CI/CD metrics that I saw. Like, and so I imagine what's happening there is like people have dashboards that they don't want to set up with authentication, and then just want to like pull some metrics or something, or just see how many clusters they have or something. And so they're binding that some roles that look like they were CI/CD to anonymous. And so given those use cases of which like they're all sort of, I think the health checks is the major one there. I think the others and maybe the bootstrapping, I think the others are sort of pretty marginal and smaller. I saw a comment from Ted here about that they have metrics, so maybe that CI/CD thing is quite common. But I thought we should have a discussion about what we should do here. But anyway, I'll pause there and see if there's questions on that. Were you about to say something, Jordan?
Oh, just health and metrics in general. Like those are two read-only things that monitoring systems, which are pretty far flung, can be difficult to do auth integrations with. And so like health and metrics are the two that many clusters, I think, still make use of anonymous auth for. The pre-authentication like bootstrap stuff like Cubatom and Rancher, that I'm maybe less sympathetic to those use cases. Like,
yeah,
I mean, OpenShift has it. OpenShift has it. VMware Tanzu has it. So like, it's not uncommon.
Yeah, I mean, like if that's how you want to bootstrap your clusters, okay, but it's also not that hard to ship around like a low permission shared credential for grabbing a config map or something. Like that's not that hard. And that would be way better, in my opinion, than needing to propagate anonymous use like out to potentially arbitrary things just so you can like have a read from a kubepublic namespace. So I mean, it's a choice of those deployment mechanisms. Like it's not wrong exactly, but it does expose whoever ends up with that cluster to some really sharp edges.
Yeah, that's how I felt about it too. I feel like those bootstrapping cases, like it feels like the volume is low. Like we looked at all our clusters and like it's not a ton. It's enough that it's like we need to manage like a deprecation, but there's not hundreds of use cases here that I saw. It was like literally like these specific ones in this category, and then I think like the bigger category is the monitoring metrics.
So I guess I would ask to like play devil's advocate, I guess, in the other way. Like AKS is always run with anonymous auth off, and it's fine. So why don't we just tell people to just turn it off? Like, yes, I get it that you have to do some work, right? We have Prometheus doing metric scraping. We have health checks. It all works. You just give the thing creds, right? They get issued creds from us, Entra, but you guys have your own IDPs. Issue the creds and just turn off anonymous auth, right?
Yeah, I think, Jordan, you want to speak to the load balancer one? I feel like that one is maybe a bit more difficult. I mean, like security person in me wants to just say, yeah, let's just turn it off. But I think like it's been the default for a long time in Kubernetes, and it will be breaking.
Wait, anonymous auth is disabled by default, right?
No, it's not.
It's enabled by default.
It's
okay,
on by
default.
default.
Right. Okay, so AKS explicitly disables it. But I mean, again, load balancer is fine, right? It's just got the credential.
I mean, so like Specific example, kubelet doing health checks on the API server pod. Like, do you put API credentials in the API server pod manifest so kubelet can health check it itself? Like, even the way that the kubelet checks if the API server is healthy, so it should not restart it, doesn't work well.
Are you talking about? Is this a kubelet for the APIs? I mean, like, is this a self-hosted?
Like the way kubeatom and the way many providers run clusters. They have a kubelet that may be self-hosted or may just be standalone. I mean, that's how kubeatom runs every cluster. So even if you solve the bootstrapping case, like, you're going to tell the kubelet, hey, here's my API server pod, keep it running. And the way it knows it's running is by poking at health, and like, that doesn't work unless you allow anonymous auth for health specifically, or you give the kubelet credentials, which means you're like rotating tokens into I don't know, like, it just gets really awful and gorpy and does things that we tell people not to do, like put credentials inside pod manifests and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's also a weird chicken egg problem between kubelet and kube API server if that kube API server is issuing the credentials that kubelet needs to check its health.
Yeah.
That sounds fine. That sounds as sustainable as Kubernetes.
No. Like, it's not a cycle. A kubelet is standalone. This is a kubelet that's not talking to the API server.
Yeah.
It just needs to run the API server, but it needs a credential for that API server, which it can't get issued from the API server before it starts it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So-
So it's messy. So you end up
So,
needing.
Micah, you want to?
It's not insurmountable. Like, you probably have the same keys that kube API server would use to do that, so you can build a sidecar that does it. But it's
I'm just saying, like, health and metrics are like two things that they're read-only, very targeted scoping, and there's lots of systems that touch those things where auth integrations are actually difficult. Not all, but many.
Are we sure about metrics? Like, I find the idea of scraping metrics without creds to be kind of scary. Like, we never did that in OpenShift.
I think Han was looking at a subpath of metrics that was much more narrow and was, I'm fuzzy on this, but I think it was like a metrics version of the same stuff that's in like ReadyZ. So instead of just like binary good bad, it was like a similarly constrained set of information that wouldn't leak stuff, but was more than just good bad. I don't hold me to that. I don't remember a lot of details, but I remember there was a subpath of metrics that was much more targeted and scoped. Micah, you had said something in chat about load balancer stuff. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same problem, right? Like, yeah, there are workarounds, right? Like run an authenticated proxy to check the load balancer. And I remember having a discussion, it was a couple of years ago in like API machinery, I think, about a secondary health check port. And that was like just a non-goal at the time.
Yeah, I feel like if we were going to do a secondary health check port, we would have to identify what are the endpoints that we feel safe exposing on that unauthenticated
like
health check
ReadyZ
port
and everything else.
And that's the set of endpoints that I'm envisioning putting in this, like, okay, fine, but only to these endpoints for anonymous auth.
Right, and the benefit to me, well, not to rehash it all, but the benefit of a secondary port for health checks is that's probably not listened behind your load balancer or not forwarded by your load balancer. So your load balancer gets to check it, but it's not necessarily accessible by consumers. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, at that point, you're using your network topology to have like a access control on that.
Wait, always makes me uncomfortable. Like, I mean, it's a nice secondary guard, I guess, but like saying we're comfortable exposing stuff over this port and we just hope that the network is secure. Like, I wouldn't want to put anything on that port that we would be unhappy getting hit if someone found a network path to it. I mean, this is like talking about reintroducing kubelet read-only port, which we just spent like 5 years getting rid of, or at least removing reliance on. I don't think we've gotten rid of it yet, but so identifying endpoints that we think are reasonable to either do on a secondary port or do anonymously on the primary port, and then having a mode that says anonymous but only for those, would at least give a path to folks who are relying on anonymous for things that we don't have a great other answer for.
So are you imagining something that's configurable, or are you imagining like the project says you get health and metrics? That's what you get.
I'm imagining so today anonymous auth is a Boolean flag, true, false, defaults to true today. I'm imagining a true, false, or this third thing. And
But what does the third thing take?
it's in the, I don't know.
It's in the description there. So like status only or something. So like this set of
No,
stuff
what does that
that we had,
mean?
Or
So,
I mean,
like-
we could be more specific. We could have it be like here are the 5 things we recognize: health Z, ready Z, live Z, and metrics.
yeah.
And you can tell us what you want to allow anonymous auth to. And if requests outside of those things, anonymous auth just doesn't work.
Yeah,
So we
'cause
just added a nice structured authentication config. I would expect us to use it for new authentication things that have a structured need. Like,
You haven't added anything other than OIDC to authentication yet, but
you're right, but this is new. Go put it in the new thing.
that sounds great. That sounds like a good use for the new authentication config file. I support adding this to that. Yeah, I mean, rather than, I think that's a good point actually. Like, rather than saying status only and then having fights over time over like what is status and why is metrics? I only want health C. Like, saying what are the specific things we think are safe to have.
At the point that you're picking specific API paths, like why isn't this in authorization? You're still like authenticating this thing as anonymous first in all cases, and then deciding based on the path what's allowed.
So I think this is the same thing as like the user info validation and the claims validation in JOT config, right? It's an authentication policy, not an authorization policy.
Yeah, but we're saying like we will authenticate you if you're trying to talk to /status.
But we're not saying that you will be authorized to do that. Right? We are still going to run RBAC against it or your webhook or whatever, right? So if you put like /foo in there,
right. I'm saying that this third thing is more semantically authorization because you are defining a policy of what's accessible, not a policy of what identity you get.
I kind of agree, but
so yeah,
it makes me sleep better at night if I know that nothing gets past the first layer. Like, anonymous users do not exist outside of health ZA metrics.
Yeah, that's desirable. I agree with that. Like where I was going with that was, oh well, in structured authorization config we can actually say which things, right? Anyway.
So to be fair, in structured authorization config now, you could set up a webhook with cell validation for the things you want, and then it would auto deny everything else that had, like, you could totally write cell validation that basically guaranteed that all you need is a webhook that always denies, and you just correctly send access to it, and it has a failed close policy. You can totally emulate this with structured authorization config today. Jordan has already solved this for us. We're good. We can walk away now. But okay.
We can, like, in terms of next steps for this, like, I'm in favor of having some way to do this. I'm not super attached to it being at the authentication layer, though. I just like not letting things past the layer where we want to cut it off. So that would be nice. I think if we let people choose specific things, we should actually make them choose exactly what they want instead of having a status only thing that the definition of which could change over time.
I think the whole HTTP2 rapid reset stuff has made me very cautious with anything I let go beyond like the front door of the API server.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it is another option. We just put a built-in cell policy that does this. That like you can the only bindings that are allowed for system anonymous are those, and the only difference between that and today is that we build it in and we turn it on by default.
I mean, so today, I guess validating admission policies beta. So if you were okay enabling it, you could just ship a default binding in your environment or a default policy in your environments that tries to.
No, admissions only rights. That doesn't protect.
Oh, okay.
No, it would be against RBAC, right? It would be preventing you from making RBAC rules that grant anonymous or authenticated access to anything, basically.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's a good way to do it because it's still like I feel like the bad people that are doing the bad things would just delete the policy and then go create the RBAC rule they wanted because like they're trying to fix it.
I don't know. I mean, like, I feel like they most of this is happening because they don't know different. I would be my guess, and having to actively turn a security thing off, would probably give more pause. But yeah, I don't know. Like, it feels like going to just false feels very breaking. And I think we're trying to figure out if there's a reasonable middle ground here, either through some authentication thing or through a built-in cell policy or something. But yeah, I kind of agree with Toffin's comment about feeling more like authorization. But I also agree with it'd be really nice if anonymous just didn't exist.
Nothing we do at any layer after authentication will ever be as cheap as just like saying you didn't make it past the authentication layer because you weren't on one of these paths. Like
cheap
if we
in
put
what
it
way?
out
In like a DOS kind of cheap way, or
yeah. So if we say, okay, fine, you're anonymous, now continue on to like cell evaluations and authorization config, or like even
so we could put something in
authorization
structured authentication config, right? That's similar, where you can have a cell policy that says like if you don't, do you or do not present credentials, and
yeah, so you could
what
have
you
an
get,
anonymous
right?
auth with cell expression and you pass in the request info and your cell validation. If the list of expressions returns true, fine, it's allowed. Otherwise, it's not allowed. So that would match what we have for OIDC, basically, or God. That could be a way forward.
That doesn't have access to the request info, does it?
Yeah, it does. Request info is the very first thing we do. Well, panic protection is the first thing we do. Second thing is request info, then like audit and then authentic.
I'm saying the authentication config cell rules, I didn't think had access to the request info. They had access to
so today we only pass in the claims and
okay.
So yeah, this would be not new code that we would wire in. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not attached to a particular mechanism. I would like to give people a way to go from the default today to a much more scoped default in a performant way early in the chain.
Okay. Yeah, I think I agree with all that. Yeah, if this was an authorization, I'm pretty sure if like we didn't have the stuff I changed for HTTP2, you could trivially DOS the server just because you would do /metrics as your target endpoint, and in the time it would take the server to deny your request, it would be flooded before it could come back up. Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Greg, is this something that you are interested in driving?
No, maybe not personally. Maybe I'll see if I can convince someone else on my team if they want to drive it.
I think
But
either piggybacking onto the authentication config or the authorization config stuff, like as a addition on top of that, both of those give frameworks that I think could be reasonable to sort
When
of.
you say piggybacking, are you saying like just extend the existing kept?
Not necessarily, but like a follow up to that.
Okay. So it would be
Yeah,
probably a small new kept that basically
it is
says-
a captain, I think, right? Like I think it'd probably
Yeah.
do that. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. I will see if I can find someone who wants to do that.
Okay, that's cool. All right, we still got a bunch of stuff and 13 minutes left. Okay, so we did the second topic. Michael, I think you have the next topic. I reordered things so that folks other than myself would get to have.
Yeah, thanks. So for this one, like I keep seeing people write scheduling policy against node labels that are not node restricted. And it's dangerous to do that because any node compromise can trivially update those and steer workloads. And I'm wondering if there'd be any interest in just providing something built in that rejects scheduling policy if it's written against non-node restricted labels.
So Michael, I am personally not necessarily super familiar with this problem space. Could you, I don't know, add a bit more detail about like what are the steps that lead into the behavior that you're?
Yeah, so we're all familiar with node restriction admission plugin, right? Like as a node, I shouldn't be able to update my own node in ways that let me see pods scheduled or let me steer pods that should have been on other nodes to my node or manipulate other nodes in some way, etc. Part of node restriction, it has some restrictions on which labels a node is allowed to self-register with or self-update after registration. Those include most Kubernetes.io labels, topology labels, and labels, arbitrary user-provided labels that are prefixed with node restriction.io or something like that.
Remind me again, so it's been a really long time. Those are the ones that nodes are allowed to set, right?
Those are the ones that nodes are not allowed to set.
Oh, okay. Okay, they're not allowed to set.
Nodes are allowed to set anything outside of that. And that was for
I see.
backwards compatibility when we added node restriction in the first place. The
Okay.
problem is most users do not seem to know about this. And it's somewhat unnatural to write a label with this long prefix on it when you're just trying to come up with a short descriptive name for your thing. And so people will keep coming up with topology labels that are not prefixed and not node restricted, and writing scheduling policy against those labels. So like they write their node selector on their pod against those labels. And maybe they have separate pools of nodes and they expect those nodes to be labeled differently. And they expect to be able to use node selectors to do workload separation. And that's part of their security model. Well, if you have a container breakout on one of those nodes and the labels you were using are not node restricted, it is trivial for that attacker to send a node update and relabel the node that they've compromised, thus steering workloads between the supposedly isolated pools.
Okay, so did I capture it sort of like at a high level that like, so the node restriction labels are a deny list of like a specific bucket, but people don't put their special
Yep, that's
meta
basically the
meaning
problem.
labels within that bucket. They put them outside that bucket, which we say is a free-for-all for nodes. And thus a node compromise means that the separation and isolation that they were trying to make has been effectively invalidated. Because
That's
it
right.
never existed in the first place. It was relying on the node being well behaved, basically.
That's right. And so we put this restriction in place to allow you to put labels on nodes that would be better behaved. I just don't think there's a lot of awareness outside of security groups like about that feature, and I keep seeing infrastructure teams and customers write policy in unsafe ways. So this might be something we could do in pod security standards, where we say, like, if you have a node selector that uses unsafe labels, you can't do that.
Is that possible? I'm not immediately. Tim, you have your hand?
Yeah, Tim.
Can't hear you, Tim.
We hear nice white noise. Very, very soothing.
Anything?
Ah,
No,
gotcha. I hear you now.
Okay. Cool. Random audio input device. What was I saying? Yeah. So I think there's a lot of non-security reasons to want to steer scheduling. And kind of an example that comes to mind is nodes self-discovering hardware that's available to them and applying those labels to the node, and then a workload that comes along and says, hey, I want to use this accelerator type, I want to use this whatever feature.
Right. That, although those are things that you could conceivably do out of band of the node as well, right, from the controller.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but I think there's already plenty of model, or yeah, I think this is a pattern that already exists today. It would be a pretty big lift to
get. I think it's not always clear if the consumer of the pod or the person writing the scheduling stuff even has distinct pools of nodes that they expect to be isolated from each other. And so if they do have multiple pools that they think are isolated from each other, then yes, best practice is to make the thing that distinguishes your different pools be in the node restricted namespace. But something like pod security standards is a very stateless protection. Like it sees a pod and that's it. And so we have no idea if they even have multiple pools of nodes, and we should be encouraging or enforcing. I don't think there's any way we could.
Yeah, I don't want to break anyone, but it would be nice if we could offer something for the maximally paranoid, like people who are like, I just want to do all this out of band from the node. I really don't trust the node to be honest about what it has.
Can you not use like validating?
It looks like it's like looking at your pods and your scheduling stuff and saying, like, your selector didn't have any restricted labels in it. So that's like an advisory thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you can't use those other ones, like the device ones, the non-restricted ones. It just means you need to have at least one restricted one in there if you want node pool isolation.
I think that would be a fair compromise, right? Like, just require at least one.
This might be worth taking to SIG security, and like I know they have like some scanning types of projects where you can sort of do assessments on clusters. I'm not sure this one is on their radar, but it would be really good to get in documentation and scanning and tooling and recommendation type flows. Like, you've got selectors and you're not using a single label that is node restricted. So FYI, you have no node isolation right now in terms of scheduling labels.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea. I can bring it up over there.
So I was going to ask, is this something that you could reasonably in your environments like have like a validating cell admission policy that would sort of try to catch the case where you're making, I think you said it was a scheduling policy that wasn't well thought out?
You certainly could, right? Like somebody who is security conscious enough can define their expected labeling schema and write policy around it. Really the reason I'm bringing it up here is to see if we could do something for the broader community that's not really thinking about that. Like,
we can't forbid it, and I think putting warnings on every pod that has no node restriction labels is going to be like spammy to the point of like,
right.
how do I turn off and ignore all warnings forever? Like, which is not what we want.
Yeah. You got to move the needle somehow.
Yeah, seeing what, like, checking with the places where there are things that look at cluster state and like make recommendations and like the checklists, things like that. Anything automated, making sure this is at least on that radar. Hopefully people who don't really know what they need to do, but are like, I want to be like following best practices security wise. Like getting into those checklists and tools and scanners and recommendation engine type things is at least a good first step. I could see how much that moves the needle. I don't know.
Yeah.
Quick question, just from my understanding, can nodes set labels after they're created? I thought they couldn't.
We can update them.
They can if they're not node restricted.
Okay.
There's nothing that blocks that, yeah. Unless you've done some additional policy. In a lot of cases, like if you actually, because I was reading through Kubelet recently, there are a bunch of labels it sets on first registration that it does not update. So it'd be easy to believe that it can't if you like deleted something and never saw it reconciled, but it just actually doesn't update many of them.
So certainly, I think talking with SIG security folks as a next step is a good item. Is there anything else we can do on this topic? I'm not 100% sure what like a built-in entry solution would actually look like, especially since like the right thing is almost certainly breaking.
Right. The right thing is definitely breaking, right? Which is like, I mean, really the right thing, in my opinion, would be completely breaking, which is like get rid of node self-registration and do this all top-down, which would be like a complete rewrite of how node bootstrap works in Kubernetes, which, you know, a provider could do, but I wouldn't do in the project.
You can turn off self-registration in the node today. So maybe for people who wanted to do that, like if you don't have kubelet self-register and bootstrap themselves, there's actually a lot of permissions hanging around in the API server that they don't need, and there's no corresponding lever on the API server that says don't give nodes all the self-registration bootstrap permissions.
Right, you have to build that into mission control as an extra layer yourself.
Yeah. So if kubelets already have a switch that says don't register yourself, we'll set up your API stuff. A corresponding thing on the API server that says don't, like, just take all the self-registration stuff away from nodes. It would have to be opt-in. Like we can never change the default here, I don't think.
That would actually be, that's actually an interesting option and kind of nice, right? Like if we had a switch on the API that said just like don't have node authorizer give nodes self-registration related permissions.
Yeah. Like
it makes it a little simpler for somebody to turn off self-registration and substitute their own control loop for it.
And Tim has a hand.
And then we're out of time. But...
Yep.
Yeah,
Tim.
Yeah, I feel like if we really wanted to tackle this problem in the upstream, it would probably make more sense to kind of come at it from a more holistic approach and think about something along the lines of namespace nodes. That's maybe a pretty extreme take on it, but I actually think that would be less breaking than trying to force something around node restriction.
I think that, yeah, like with, I mean, we're out of time, and that's a deep discussion on how to do namespace nodes. If you could like associate nodes with, I think you need groups of namespaces, not single namespaces,
Yeah.
to make it useful. But that that does solve the problem rather cleanly.
If you're interested, maybe as a follow-up, like Michael, maybe you could have like a small doc with some high-level ideas that we might be able to discuss in a future meeting with like more specific, like, does this make sense or does this make sense? And like maybe some pros and cons so we can kind of.
Yeah, I can definitely do that. Yep.
I also have no idea what Tim you meant by namespacing a node. I don't really understand how a node gets namespaced.
Yeah, I should have explained that better. I mean a way of saying that this node can only run pods from some set of namespaces. I think you probably need something on the flip side that says this set of namespaces can only run on nodes that are restricted to it, or something like that.
How does that protect you from this problem? And I know we're like 2 minutes over time now.
It gives you a way to define which like separation between workloads in terms of nodes and namespaces, or namespace is the bucket for workloads, right? And then you say these nodes are split between these namespaces. I don't know what we do for daemons in that case. There's a lot of edge cases to think about if we went for namespace nodes, but the advantage is that it's non-breaking because we are adding a new API.
It's also going back to one of the kind of central theses of pod admission, that security policy should be at the namespace layer. So really, if you're trying to do kind of restriction around like scheduling constraints, you probably are going to, in addition to setting up the scheduling labels, you're probably going to have some sort of, if it's in this namespace, you have to run these node selectors or something like that. So it kind of simplifies all of that and just says this namespace runs in this set of nodes, kind of like that. But yeah, sorry to derail the conversation on that. It's a much bigger, broader topic.
Okay, with that, I think we're 4 minutes over time, so I'll move all the remaining topics to the next year's meetings. All right, so have a good holiday season, everyone. We'll see y'all in 2024.
Thanks. See you.
Bye.